So I'd like to start by uh, introducing Achinta Mudari. He is a senior analyst with the Retail Rates Department of the PUC, and he is doing fascinating work to think about what kind of prices might we use in California for thinking about the electricity markets of the future. And then we'll have Beth Reed from Olivine, who will be sharing some of her activities and learnings from the third-party engagement with some of the working groups that are exploring how to use electricity rates to incentivize dynamic loads. So Achinta has a PhD from UC Berkeley, and you can come on up, and I think we'll give him about 10 minutes, and then Beth will be remote, so she's our only remote person, and we'll have a fun Q&A between the three of us later. And we'll see how it works to have her big face up here joining us. So please.
Thank you, Marianne. And happy to be here. Very excited to talk about what the CPUC has been doing with regards to demand flexibility and the types of rates. I hope for an engaging discussion with the panel today. So you can go to the next slide. So I think we're noticing, and I think this has been mentioned in the past, as sort of an urgent crisis when it comes to retail rates. If we're talking about the need to electrify end uses, the need to incent customers to adopt technologies that can decarbonize the grid, it's hard to do that as we're seeing some of the projections of where retail rates are going to go in California. And there's also an issue of who bears the brunt of these retail rates. Certainly, there's a bit of a tale of two states issue with California, with our coastal customers who are less energy burdened than a lot of the inland customers. So we're trying to address this issue of the forecasts of where rates are going, how they're projected to outstrip inflation over the coming decades, even with the current levels of inflation. And I think what the CPUC or the ED staff, Energy Division staff, has noticed is that the current rate offerings are not incentivizing the type of behavior that can reduce long-term system costs. There are a few silver linings. There is a great degree of momentum when it comes to EV sales within California. And we're also noticing that those customers on our EV-specific rates are indeed able to be more flexible in response to price. So there's certainly a big opportunity there, and I think we believe, Energy Division believes, that greater electrification can lead to lower energy costs. So what staff from the Energy Division has proposed is a flexible unified signal for energy for California, or CalFuse. And this is a rate reform that aims to create more value for all customers through dynamic retail rates. Next slide, please. So we're certainly seeing the acceleration of the duck curve. I think our current set of rate offerings have really not abated the growth of the belly of the duck, I guess. And there's along with sort of the issues of curtailment that do arise, and certainly a lot of energy is being curtailed that could otherwise be used with a more flexible use of energy on the demand side. There's also the need to manage the ramp. And that has led to a greater reliance or a continued reliance on our existing natural gas assets, for instance, a lot of the flexible generation assets on the bulk side. And these reliability and stability challenges both drive and as a result are of the cost of service and pricing distortion that exists in current retail rates. So we believe going forward, we can use pricing as a tool to meet the challenges that we already face. So the mix of demand response, more effective retail rates can address the challenge, but a highly scalable and low cost approach is necessary. Something that can scale easily across the state, that cannot rely on one-off rates, one-off interventions for every type of end use, something that can be used by any aggregator of any type of technology going forward. Next slide, please. So what our staff vision is for the future of retail rates is we envision prices that are informed by the grid, not just the energy costs of the grid, but the capacity constraints that the grid faces at multiple levels, not just generation, but distribution and transmission, going to devices, and that flexible demand in turn meeting the price, meeting the needs of the grid, and reducing leading to lower costs in the long run. And ultimately leading to the reduced cost of service that we believe will encourage this virtuous cycle rather than the vicious cycle that we're trapped in. Next slide, please. So why dynamic retail rates rather than the status quo? And this has been, I think, something that we staff have noticed and noted in our white paper that we released in 2022. The existing piecemeal approach has a basket of supply side DR programs, some distribution level DR programs, large menu of boutique rates. We don't think that this is a strategy to scale load flexibility. This is too complicated. And it's always worth keeping this in mind compared to the complication or perceived complication of something like a dynamic retail rate. There's program complexity and rate complexity. Their complexity can exist in multiple forms, and I think one could argue, we argue, that the existing level of complexity and fragmentation is potentially a higher barrier than something that is a more effective price signal. So that's sort of the motivation behind our proposal for CalFuse. It reduces complexity. It's a single point of focus, a single price stream that's applicable to all end users, all customers, all parts of the state. We believe that it can lead to the highly scalable, widespread adoption of the types of technologies that I think everyone has been talking about in the symposium so far. We also believe that it can lead to reduced costs of automation and controls. I mean, I think, again, if all the incentive streams are unified, there is a single thing that needs to be optimized for. And so we're bullish, staff is bullish on the notion of price being that single point of focus that can reduce the cost of automation. And also, of course, providing an avenue for pricing to be as close to marginal costs as possible for new end uses of technology is going to be essential in driving investments. And we believe that we can do that with something that with what we've proposed and as part of the CalFuse proposal. Next slide, please. So I won't be diving in too deep. I'm happy to go into the details. I think before I maybe go into where we are as the CPUC, where the CPUC stands, where the regulatory landscape looks like, I will mention that the white paper that I'm referencing with the CalFuse proposal, this was released in 2022. We've held multiple workshops. Those are all publicly available. So I would encourage everyone here who's not familiar to please do check it out. But we're also, it's sort of not just a proposal that's coming from staff for a neat idea. There are multiple regulatory levers that are being pushed across the state by both the Energy Commission as well as the CPUC. So the Energy Commission has adopted updated load management standards, which require California's large utilities and the publicly owned utilities, investor-owned utilities, as well as the CCAs, to develop retail rates that change at least hourly based on grid costs and GHG emissions, and are approved by the governing board. In the case of the IOUs, that would be the CPUC. And the CEC has also required the load-serving entities of the state to maintain up-to-date rates in a database, which is the MIDAS server, which will provide a central repository for all rate information, and including the dynamic retail rates that will be required from the large electric companies of California. And they also would require all these companies to educate customers about time-dependent rates and automation technologies to encourage their use. Next slide, please. With regards to the CPUC itself, so as I mentioned, we released a white paper, staff released a white paper from the Energy Division in mid-2022. We've commission authorized pilots that are in effect. There's an ag pumping pilot in the Davis area with Valley Clean Energy and PG&E as the load serving entity in the utility, and then Polaris and TMIX as the project partners. And the CPUC in 2022 also launched the demand flexibility rulemaking, where there's been an active working group process deliberating with stakeholders on how the rate design of dynamic rates ought to be, what systems and processes ought to be authorized for the utilities, so that they can support the sort of ecosystem that we're envisioning with widespread dynamic rates for all customers. And there's also been a staff proposal that was released in August of this year, and with a proposal to expand the existing dynamic rate pilots across the state to both other parts of PG&E service territory, and to extend the pilot that was already authorized in Southern California Edison's territory. That the CPUC is expected to provide a proposed decision on those pilots sometime late this year. And early next year, the CPUC is expected to provide a proposed decision regarding the rate design guidance, the systems and processes that the IOUs should adopt for dynamic rates. And all this is kept in mind with the adopted goal by the CEC of 7,000 megawatts of flexible of load shift by 2030. So there's sort of a lockstep agreement between the two major agencies of the state, and everything is proceeding towards, I think, this notion of widespread dynamic prices and widespread load shift, and with all deliberate speed. So next slide, please. Okay, I think that's probably where I'll pause for as far as where things stand. Yeah, thank you.
You can sit either place, yeah. So thank you so much, Achintia. We're gonna start the Q&A after Beth Reed gives her remarks. And Beth is the lead of Olivine, and she has a long history working with customers and the energy systems providers on clean, affordable, and reliable energy systems. And she'll be talking about some of her activities and the role of third parties in the flexibility tariffs. So Beth, look forward to your comments.
Well, thank you, Marianne. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person today, but I appreciate being able to participate remotely. So thank you very much. As Achintia mentioned, there was the rulemaking that he just mentioned. Olivine and a number of third parties participated in that rulemaking. And in particular, I spent quite a bit of time with the one of the subgroups within Working Group 2 that was attempting to put together a third-party proposal for what are the kinds of things that the CPUC should be ordering the utilities to do in order to facilitate this move and this change in the venue, in the ecosystem. And so what we wanted to do today is give you a little bit of sense of some of the things that we ran into during those working groups, that kind of color some of the input from the third parties, and just give you a little bit of sense of where that's coming from, so we can put these two pieces together. Would you mind going to the first slide? So first of all, we spent quite a bit of time thinking about the role of the third parties. You know, what is their role in flexible load transition process? And one of the things that I think is really interesting is just the term third parties. It's a broad term. There's lots of different parties that can be participating in this. And a lot of times when we would, in CPUC proceedings, when we refer to third parties, what people were really referring to was third-party aggregators. And in this case, this is not really what we're talking about. We're talking about a lot of different third parties. We actually took the third parties that would be involved, and we broke them down into 4 different categories, which is consistent with how the Energy Division staff was looking at things. So there were application developers, device manufacturers, automation service providers, energy management service providers, and DR operators and aggregators. And of course, what makes it complicated is there are a lot of parties who are more than one of those things. So the ecosystem right now is a little, it just isn't clear where people fit in. What we did is tried to take a look at all the different types of things and what does the transition really look like. And so we focused on transitioning from auto DR to auto PR. And that meant that a lot of the third parties, especially those who are revenues-based aggregators, are going to have to transition to more of a bill savings model. And that was a little bit difficult because I'm really talking to parties about what we need to ask the CPUC to authorize. And we're really asking people to say, how can we basically cannibalize your current business model, the ones that you've just taken the last 5 years to build? What would it take? Can you tell us what it would take to cannibalize it and move over to another business model? So it was a really interesting process. And I think that it was a process even when I was engaging with different members of the working groups, and it was a small subset that were looking at the third party avenue. I think things changed throughout that process. Different people were thinking about what their business model might look like, and initially were really struggling with what their business model could be. And at the end of the process, a couple months later, people had different ideas about what it might look like, but still kind of struggling with that. So the fact that it's going to require new business models and new service delivery methods was near and dear to everybody's heart, and was really, people were really, when I struggle, I don't mean that it's necessarily bad, but trying to embrace that change and figure out what it means to them. And I think that what became very clear, if it wasn't evident already, is across the nation, anybody transitioning to this kind of move, California all the way, anywhere else you're kind of going through this kind of transition, you've got a lot of competing concerns. There's issues about access. There's issues about equity. There's issues about third-party roles. We had a lot of discussions about consumer protection. When the automation comes in, who's going to be allowed to do what? And I think that it's an interesting time, though, to grapple with all these different issues and try to understand where different people fit into the ecosystem. Next slide, please. So wanted to illustrate for you a little bit of what are some of the challenges that were raised. Cost of the transition, of course, was near and dear to everybody's heart. The cost of the transition seems very high. And so there was a constant discussion about the cost of the transition now versus actually being able to make that transition, where we would be after the end of the transition, and who should be paying those costs. How much should be borne by the state? How much should be borne through incentives? How much should the different corporations or different companies have to deal with the cost of the transition? Specifically for a lot of the different parties, it was cost of integration. Suddenly they're having to deal with a lot of different types of tools, doing a lot of different types of integrations. There were, again, different parties. So as you see here, like the ASPs, the aggregators, and the OEMs really had some differing viewpoints about where they would fit into the ecosystem. One place in particular was equitable access to controlled devices. And I think equitable is an important word here. There was a lot of debate of whether that meant equal access, what's equitable, should OEMs and different technology providers actually have to give access to say, third parties who don't own the technology? What should that be baked into the transition, so that maybe incentives are not given to technology providers that don't provide access to other third parties? And so this was a big debate. And I think where we ended up, and I think this is where we ended up, is that we really felt there should be incentives and encouragement so that device manufacturers could offer options for other third parties to be able to control and be part of the ecosystem. And that there were some ways that we could consider incentivizing those parties, but that going so far as to mandate it would really be out of the realm of what the CPUC could do, what the utilities could do, and what may not be appropriate for building the ecosystem. I think another big point here was ensuring customer choice. And those two, the point I just mentioned and that one is connected, but there was a lot of discussion about ensuring customer choice. How are customers going to be able to choose who they want to manage their loads? How is that actually going to work, and who's going to have access to things? And there's a lot of different permutations and discussions around that. And a big part of the discussion was also about educating customers. There was a real concern that we would build it and assume they would come, and that up front, we really need to make sure that we are really looking at educating customers. How are they going to achieve bill savings with dynamic rates? What's really going to happen to them? Why should they actually even sign on for a dynamic rate? And also providing equitable and cost-effective access for those customers who may not be able to afford the automation which dynamic rates really depend on. And so there was a definite viewpoint throughout everybody in the working group. I would say that was one of the areas that everybody did agree on. How we did it, maybe not so much, but I think everybody's really was really focused on the fact that because automation is required here, there needs to be some special consideration for how to bring in customers who are either low income, located in DACs, and may not have the access to the technology that is needed. There's not so much any concerns about does the technology exist, but more about the access and how can everyone have that access so that we're not leaving a huge part of the population behind in this transition. Next slide. So we also talked a lot about the opportunities that are involved. So providing these expertise, there's a lot of parties in the state of California right now, and they're new entrants all the time, but there's a lot of parties who have a lot of expertise in being able to manage customer devices and loads. And it's perceived that the third parties are typically or historically have been the best at managing the loads. So there might be some real opportunity there working with OEMs, working with other device manufacturers, figuring out how the ecosystem could look a little bit different than it does right now. A big opportunity is capturing value streams from multiple sources. And specifically, a big challenge, but also a big opportunity, was in managing customer loads with multiple devices. So a lot of device manufacturers, of course, are focused on managing loads associated with that particular device, or the device that they've manufactured. And so we thought there was a huge opportunity there to really be thinking about that sweet spot is when you're dealing with customer loads that have multiple devices. I know I certainly felt very strongly throughout this entire process that the way forward, 7,000 megawatts, the way forward is going to need to be for all stakeholders to work together. If we're going to ensure any of these guidelines, any of these things that we think for the state are very important, a lot of different stakeholders who may not have historically worked together very much are going to need to make this transition happen. Next slide. So Olivine, since its inception, has been really working a lot on the forefront of what is it that we can prove? How can we move to different business models? We've gone through quite a few in the last 10, 15 years in the state of California. What are we going to do that is going to help prove out a little bit and mitigate some of the risks as we go through transitions? So we're very proud of being able to be part of a lot of projects that are focused on those transitions, and in particular, the third-party role within the CalFlex demo projects. So we do have a number of projects that we are working on as part of the CalFlex Hub. We wanted to at least illustrate a few of them, some of the lessons learned. Within this makeup, we have a couple of thermostat providers. We have a battery firm HVAC. We have an EV aggregation. We're working through telematics. And we also have a broad campus HVAC system. And so within those demo projects, we're focusing on these types of things here that we have up here, where we're looking at how can we control the last mile to the devices directly? How can we control more than one device in a facility? The kinds of things that have come up during these working groups as questions, we think the more that we can demonstrate on a small scale and work out some of these issues and share them with the population, other vendors, other people who might be part of this ecosystem to make this leap, the better off we are. The two lessons learned that we're specifically focusing on is the customer experience and reliability of load flexibility and new baseline methodologies. So wanted to just close with a couple of thoughts here. There are 5 items through the working group that we felt were very important. The customer ability to access prices. The fact that a lot of this technology already exists and is not the biggest obstacle here. the need to help the disadvantaged, people are in low income who need automation, and the plan to leverage what already exists. So even though we're going through a transition, we have a lot built within our ecosystem. We have a lot of capabilities within the ecosystem. So we felt it was very important to leverage what already exists and to educate people about what already exists. I think my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth. So we're going to start by just going through a few questions online and seeing how it works to do this with two people in different ways. So we're testing the world we live in now. Scott, what have you got for us?
Okay, this one thanked everyone for the presentations and asked, the CPUC Public Advocate's Office expresses frequent concern over continually soaring electric rates, especially for those who cannot afford electric vehicles, solar, battery packs, etc. Please explain your assumption that greater or ubiquitous electrification can lead to lower energy costs. Does this apply only to those who can't afford to electrify, or do you anticipate ongoing higher costs during the transition period?
Yeah, I think it's always hard to predict, exactly what is going to happen. I mean, we can make projections based on, certain projections of load growth, but I think even the Cal Advocates released a study recently where they did show that if there is sustained load growth, new electrification, it sort of, in the long run, can drive down the average rate. And that's just a result of the fact that there's a certain number of costs for the utilities that are fixed. I mean, these are the cost of the poles, the wires, a lot of the services that are part of ensuring reliable operation of the existing grid. And then there's also the variable costs. So if you can have a larger larger demand, larger kilowatt hours to spread across a lot of the fixed costs, then there can be, a drive down of some of the costs that some of the average rates that we are experiencing today. But that is going to be very tricky to manage because there's the way that investments are done are very lumpy. I mean, there's sort of a grid needs assessment, there's distribution upgrades that are projected and that are authorized. But those upgrades in anticipation of future load can drive up the rate, and which in turn can have the negative effect in terms of incenting more customers to adopt the type of end uses that would increase the kilowatt hour sales base. So managing that challenge is going to be crucial, and I think is going to require multiple parts of the regulators to try to nail that down. But that's sort of why we are suggesting that dynamic rates are an important element, is because if you can encourage more efficiency in the usage of existing resources, then there's at least the potential to stick the sort of golden path from where we are right now to where we hope to be in 20, 30 years.
Next one, Scott.
Yeah, we have one more. So this one is related to EVSE installation. So kind of an adjacent topic. When or will the CPUC mandate that the investor-owned utilities install dedicated meters and EVSE equipment, either level 1 or low power level 2 at multifamily residential units?
I don't know if I can really answer this question. This is a bit outside of my purview, so I'll pass on this. Yeah, I know that there's a sub-metering decision that was adopted recently, but I don't know the details, and I think it's.
Okay, this is a question for Beth. At scale, everyone wishes to disintermediate all of the innovators that have allowed California to make the progress it has made towards flexible loads. Will there truly be any business models left open to these companies if machines get prices directly?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And that was, I think, the lion's share of the debate, that we had during some of the subgroups in the working group. My personal take on that is I think there will be, Tristan, I think there is some, but I don't think initially, and I think that some of the players will change out. I think that there's just a reality here that this is a big change, but the change isn't going to happen overnight. This is a transition and it's not going to happen tomorrow. So I think there is a lot of opportunity for different business models. I think the first issue, and a lot of, Olivine's part of this too, is we feel a little bit like we've been so much a part of making the change to get us where we are. And there's so many of us who have been very innovative to get us to the place that we are at. And now it feels a little bit like, okay, that's great. We're just going to move on to something else and leave you guys in the dust. And I think that's a real challenge for a lot of people emotionally to kind of figure out, especially some of the smaller companies that either don't have the wherewithal or don't have the devices available. But I think there is a lot of room. I think especially in the areas where we're talking about multiple devices in a home, I think there's a huge opening there. I also think that to get to 7,000 megawatts, we can't get rid of what we already have. So we've got a long way to go before it's not like a curtain's going to come down. I wish I had an answer that said, this is exactly where we should all go and everything will work out perfectly. But I did through that process, and I started questioning it, but through the process of the working group, I came to the conclusion that there is definitely some business models that can work during this that would still be able to capture most of the innovators that still exist in California.
Thanks so much, Beth. Anything else, Scott? That's it. Oh, in the room. So should we take the mic to the folks in the room that have questions?
But we do encourage you to use the Zoom app.
Yeah.
And this is especially for Beth. Mark Roost, Sustainable Energy, Inc. Opportunity, third-party managed loads and managed mass-owned distributed energy resource and storage. So if you take your same business model and you expand it to include taking flex load transition process to its logical conclusion. So it isn't only saving on the use on the load, it's also providing the load, providing the supply.
Absolutely.
And, yeah. So especially when we're going to be looking at prices like with the IRA, $3 a kilowatt hour for batteries and maybe 20 some odd cents a watt for solar PV. It's going to be possible to put enough to actually be meaningful in your equation, and that'll give you the space to be able to do the entire package. And because it is actually an entirely different business model and a competing business model with the utilities, you'll have a reason to survive.
I like that. I think one of the things, just in me speaking for some of the other parties, and I don't mean to speak for them, but trying to relay, is I think that there was a question about the cost of the transition, and you were specifically directing that towards the CPUC and energy rates. But for a number of small third parties, the cost of this transition may feel prohibitive. And that was one of the challenges that we had in a lot of the discussions, is how can we actually make that transition reasonable for a lot of the parties and to be able to expand their business models, as you're talking about. I definitely believe there's that opportunity. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity, like you said, to compete. There's a lot of opportunity to bring more to the table. I think there's a question about creating different approaches, VPPs, taking a look at different kinds of subscription services. One of the big challenges was more on the residential side, in really taking a look at access. So, and I mentioned that in my presentation, but it was a big debate, because there's a lot of issues around this. For a lot of parties, when you're looking at how much is it going to cost to pay a vendor or some kind of device manufacturer access to that device, and be able to afford to actually do that control and do that integration. I think that was daunting. I think it is daunting to a lot of people, especially some of the smaller entities who may have been doing really well for the last few years. And they're going to have to transition into thinking, to your point, about a broader perspective. What can their portfolio look like? They're going to have to change their models.
Thanks so much, Beth. Any other questions in the room? Got one here. And say your name and affiliation so we know.
My name is Wei Ping, and I'm affiliated with LBNL. My question is about the CalFuse framework. Is like, do small residential customers be able to subscribe to the CalFuse like hourly pricing, even though they don't have any like flexible devices?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, yes, there certainly will be in the sense that what the CEC's load management standards mandate is that an optional rate or program should be made available to all customers, so including small residential customers. Whether they can respond, I guess maybe that's the other question. And yes, I think we can see behavioral based response to hourly rates as well. And I've heard arguments for why in some ways it may be easier, because when you concentrate the signal into fewer hours, and that ends up being the case, that the price may be more concentrated from a particular, particularly from, let's say, 7 to 8 p.m., rather than the full 4-hour window from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. or 4 p.m. to 9 p.m., the 5-hour window. Some of the interventions that people do on a behavioral basis, such as turning down their thermostats, may become easier. It's easier to avoid a 2-hour window than it is to avoid a 4-hour window, right? And so there could be some co-benefits with more precise price signals. And yeah.
Thank you so much.
Quick question over here. While you're getting the microphone over there, I think that one of our challenges is, how does the customer see those prices? Because right now they're set up, Midas and CalFuse are set up for ASPs, but we need like just a customer app so they can see the prices too. You can imagine a simple, but that's a lot of things pinging Midas, which Midas wasn't really designed for. Midas is designed for automation service providers to ping it. So it's one of our kind of architecture challenges.
And Marianne, that was actually one of the things in the working group and in the third party side where there was a request or a proposal to have a tool to address that, to whether extending Midas, actually have another tool to address that. It was very, it was a very obvious area. And I think certainly everybody I talked to, I can't speak obviously for where the energy division is going to go with that, but it was a definite ongoing discussion throughout the working group meetings. And there is different approaches. Everybody has there's several different approaches to it, but everybody was supportive of a statewide tool and to be working with Midas to be able to ensure that customers all have access.
Sounds great. They just need to know their RIN. So they're
and a major tenet was so that they had access on an hourly basis.
Okay, thank you so much, Beth. Thanks for adding that. So we have one more question in the room before we go to the next session.
Yeah, Don Bray with Silicon Valley Clean Energy. Thank you both for really excellent presentations. So interested in your thoughts on dual enrollment. If a customer can be on a real-time rate and perhaps participating in a market-based demand response program, especially during this transition.
So yeah, I mean, I think this is something that has to be ironed out. The staff proposal that Energy Division put out for expanding the pilots currently, staff suggested that some of those market-based programs maybe should not be allowed to participate because there are complications with the CAISO market rules. that it wasn't clear how, if there was a process already set up to accommodate those dual participation rules or those market rules. Event-based programs such as BIP or ELRP, staff suggested could, at least for the pilot phase, be accommodated. There's a different trigger mechanism. There's obviously some interaction with what the wholesale price is likely to be. But since the dynamic prices, the CalFuse signal is direct pass-through of the market price, it was unclear how at least supply-side DR programs ought to be integrated, or how the existing market rule agreements could be honored. And so that's about, I think, as much as I can say from staff's perspective.
Yeah, I could think from a third party perspective, we all felt that was very strongly a part of the transition, but understand the points that staff made, and that in order to protect, I guess, the flexibility that we currently do have, we believe that they will both coexist, which is different than dual participation. The belief is during this transition period, both of those things would need to coexist, and that we need to honor that. And that throughout that transition, we need to look at ways to be able to allow for either dual participation or a reasonable transition that approximates dual participation. So that was one of the recommendations that we made. But as Achintia just mentioned, there is a lot of conflicts on the wholesale market side. However, we don't think it's going to happen. This is not going to happen like in 2024. There's a curtain that goes down. We have time while two things coexist to try to work out what those rules look like. The two things that we felt very strongly about were coexistence and dual participation, which I would put into one bucket. And also for people who might have, are in this transition period, is to have some kind of bill protection for people who are willing to be some of the first adopters into the dynamic rate situation.
Yeah, and this is unrelated to the question, but maybe more related to the prior question. One of the things that we learned in the working groups, we had a presentation from the climate attaché from Denmark, and they presented what is available for the Danish customers, and we found that very instructive. It was very forward-thinking. They have indeed a customer app with prices. So and they're seeing behavioral response from their residential customers. And so the whole sort of from the market to the retailer integration was something that they had thought through and had executed on in a very thoughtful manner. And so it was instructive to see how it could be done. I mean, we hope that we can do something similar, but it remains to be seen how it's implemented. But just pointing out, I mean, this might be something that people might want to look at, and some of their initial results, even for residential customers, have been very eye-opening. Something like 20% load shift from peak to off-peak in response to real-time pricing, and of course, the technology that they adopted to enable customers to respond to real-time pricing.
Well, thank you so much. We're gonna say thanks to our speakers. Really appreciate it. Thank you. So that was a really wonderful to hear about the regulatory activities and where we're heading with the price response activities and what some of the challenges are for the third parties. We're now going to